series, which is one of the projects I'm leading on for this term. This series provides an opportunity for students and academics to hear from leading China scholars and authors from around the world. In today's book talk session, we will have our two panelists, our book author and our chair. And this panel will be in a discussion format where the author will engage in a discussion with our chair briefly after talking about her book. As audience members, you can send the questions through the Q&A box below at any point of the discussion, and the panel will answer your questions in the Q&A session after the discussion. So in today's webinar, we welcome Dr. Una Bērziņa-Čerenkova, who will talk about her new book, Perfect Imbalance, China and Russia, in conversation with Professor Kerry Brown. Dr. Una Bērziņa-Čerenkova is a political scientist, China scholar, head of political science of the PhD program and China Studies Center at Riga Stradins University, head of Asia program at the Latvian Institute of International Affairs, a member of CHERN and European Think Tank Network of China. Professor Kerry Brown is a professor of Chinese studies and director of the Lau China Institute at King's College London. He's an associate of the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House, London. And prior to academia, Kerry's also worked for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office as a British diplomat in Beijing. I would now like to hand it over to Professor Kerry Brown. Welcome, Kerry.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, everyone, for attending today. And particularly thank you to Una Bērziņa-Čerenkova for kindly agreeing to talk about her book, which has just been published, about Russia and China relations. In fact, I first met Una in Beijing at the Diaoyutai guest house, I think, at a conference about Europe and China in, I think, 2015. I remember us having discussion about Hu Jintao and his language, which is probably not something that people would speak about very often, as Hu Jintao is infamously fairly wooden and kind of not a very communicative speaker. But Una was already working on the ways in which Chinese leaders spoke, and we had a common interest. The book that she has published with World Scientific Singapore is a pretty timely study, in fact, because, of course, Russia's relations with China are now under the spotlight as never before, and the kind of depth and complexity of those relationships has been, many people have been asking questions about them. She's particularly well placed to talk about this as a Russian speaker, I believe, and also a very good Chinese speaker, and someone who has a good understanding of the dynamics and politics in both places, but is also an outsider, and that's a good critical position to be in. So I think Una is going to speak for 10 minutes or so about the main arguments of her book, and then we'll have an opportunity for some discussion. So over to you, Una.
Thank you, dear Kerry. Thank you, Professor Brown. Thank you, everyone who helped organize this launch. I want to say this book actually exists because of Kerry, because Kerry told me one day, he said, I think it was when he visited us in Riga for an event, he said, well, if you have anything to say, put it on paper, write a book. And then when people ask you, what do you think? You just give them the book. So here we are, and I followed that advice. The book that I want to present today, actually what came out of this major central question that bothered me for quite some time, which is how close is Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's China really getting? Because there are such contradictory readings to this. And of course, there are similarities to these countries. They're similar and distinct actors. They both are run by authoritarian strongmen who both have the ability for perpetual rule. They're also partners, but not quite teeth and lips. They're treaty-bound neighbors since 1682, since Nerchinsk. And since that time, it's been an unstopping accommodation, but also curbing of each other's ambitions. They're both multi-ethnic societies that are integrated around the core of this main nation, trying to negotiate these relationships within. They are both, of course, challengers to the existing Western supranational political, financial, and value systems. But, and that is, I think, a very important point, to a varying degree, because they owe their discontent with the West to different histories. Another thing that I felt as a hunch going into this was the fact that narratives do not match the reality, and yet there's a power to them. And as a discourse analyst, that fascinated me. How can a narrative be not based in something and yet hold such, and yet be reiterated and have such power? Well, I will shortly introduce the concept itself. Why is the book called Perfect Imbalance? And then I will use the remaining time to outline some of the conclusions. Well, I did not invent perfect imbalance. It comes from the game development industry. It's an applied concept, actually. And what it means is that when there is a game, for example, there are two players playing online. One of them is has been playing for a very long time, is very experienced, has a lot of weapons, has accumulated a lot of expertise. And then a new player shows up, just logged in, just registered, just bought the game. How do you make sure that this new player still wants to play, that they are not doomed the second they spawn in the game? And the game development industry came up with this perfect imbalance concept, which basically means there's always some way to beat the best. As long as each side has some sort of leverage, even imbalanced, and there's some sort of interdependence, the strong player has to sleep with one eye open, and the weak player always stands a chance. And I think that works for the Russia-China relationship, because sometimes we get caught up in the asymmetry argument. We often hear that Russia is the junior partner of this relationship, which is economically true, and also is of course true on other levels, and that this asymmetry, but basically that this asymmetry leaves Russia with no leverage. And I think as per Perfect Imbalance, we see that shared interdependence and leverage demonstrates that there is some cooperation to be had, even though the sides are imbalanced. But the second, a more important point why I chose this concept is because perfect imbalance is unstable. Also, and I think that that is a good explanation for the question we're being asked a lot: how stable and how looking long-term real is this partnership? Can it be shaken? And I think this answers this concept of perfect imbalance answers that. Because the side that feels disadvantaged will use every mean in the book, including other parties, like Russia is doing by inviting India and bringing India in to leverage and to balance out China in its policy documents and also in its conversations. So this disadvantaged side is going to bring other parties and other means to balance it out, but there's always anxiety long-term. Now to some of the conclusions. So jumping ahead and saying that to answer the question that I asked at the beginning, how close are these two getting? My book certainly is not an argument in favor of an alliance thinking. So I did not believe going in that we're going to find proof of Russia-China establishing a mutually binding mutual defense clause, full-scale defense alliance, and I still don't believe it. Maybe I'm a little bit bound by my own preconceptions here, but still, how did I go about this analysis? First, I thought it would be important to look at what Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, and of course their respective foreign policy establishments, say about the relationship in general. How do they frame this relationship? How do they talk across the audiences, across the border, to point out what is the relationship like? And three overarching narratives immediately appeared in these documents and in these conversations. First of all, the story of close friendship between the leaders and the countries. So kind of the story of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin being friends. The second narrative, which also jumped borders and was ever present in this communication, was the promise of high value added cooperation. So it was basically China promising Russia that we want your innovation, we want your high value added production. We want to launch cooperation not in these traditional energy issues, but rather we want to learn from you, right? And that is something that rings deep with the Russian population, because they have this belief that they are innovators at the end of the day. So, but of course, again, coming back to what I started with, there's no truth to this. This is not really the case, and still this narrative is so strong. And the third overarching narrative was the attempt to reconcile the Chinese and Russian vision of Eurasian connectivity. China talking about Belt and Road, Russia talking about Eurasian Economic Union, talking past each other, but kind of brushing over the differences. And the next step, I wanted to probe into how these establishments frame more tangible cooperation after establishing the narratives, and also to cross-check Putin and Xi's stories with what was really happening. And so I dove into a couple of case studies. I took a look at the Arctic, examined cases of Russian and Chinese activities and what they call each other's neighborhoods, at Russia's activities in Vietnam and cooperation with Vietnam, and Chinese activities in Central Asia. Of course, I had to bring in India as an unignorable presence, because as per Perfect Imbalance, it's never just about the two players. I also took a look at the Russian-Chinese complementarity in the space frontier. Now I have to acknowledge my limitation immediately. I think it was hard for me to write that chapter because I do not come from that field. I did a lot of interviews. So my major method was discourse analysis, but of course, it doesn't have enough reach to be able to make these conclusions. So I had to interview a lot, talk a lot, read a lot. Another case study that I took a look at was the COVID-19 pandemic and how it served as a stress test of the Sino-Russian relations. I took a look at this in the early days. That was like the first wave analysis. Basically, how the partners dealt with COVID-19 on the discursive level, how they tried to renegotiate their global roles, and how they tried to replay their mutual dependencies. And also the administrative level and the operational level. So, and as a result of this, I do not believe in the Sino-Russian alliance theory, because Russia has not really pivoted towards China. It is a power that has pivoted towards itself. However, does that mean that there is limits in sight for the partnership with no limits between Russia and China? No, this partnership will continue to grow and expand, looking for this perfect imbalance, because both of domestic and external factors that we can also touch upon the Q&A. But also there's a lot of the parallels in the international arena and these outside pressures that are pushing these two countries together. And they do not need an official black and white mutual defense clause to maintain this partnership. They're very comfortable with the existing level of cooperation. I think we see that also in terms of messaging surrounding Russia's war in Ukraine, because it is enough to keep the West, predominantly the United States, worried. But at the same time, not challenging the nationalist self-reliance logic that is driving these two countries. There are also challenges that remain under the surface, and I'm happy to talk about them more in the Q&A. But not to eat up too much of time. But there are, for example, one of them, even before Ukraine, we already could establish that China, in fact, deems Russian outlashes towards the West to be counterproductive, emotional, and counterproductive to international stability at times. So Xi Jinping's great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is not necessarily a disruptivist development goal, whereas the Russian actions were sometimes perceived as being disruptivist in Beijing. To sum up and to put a comma here, a joint Xi-Putin statement a couple of years back reads, Russia is interested in a stable and prosperous China, and China is interested in a strong and successful Russia. So not quite the same goals, but mutual interests, and also both sides are interested in the other side being stable. But what do we what do us in the West, what is it that we would find most beneficial in terms of this relationship? Because it's always about our side as well. And I argue that the existing level of the relationship, and that's a complicated argument, and I've been challenged on this before, basically that the existing level of partnership is actually not a bad thing, because there are so many issues, so many challenges between these two partners that they are not just in a position right now to exert stronger pressure on the international order, but a disruption between them would escalate until there would be no more international order left to protect. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Great, thanks, Una. So that's given a really good overview of the sort of broad themes and the approach you've taken. I suppose what would be helpful is to look at very current issues and see how you feel that framework helps us understand some of the controversies about China's relations with Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. One thing that I wanted to ask was about the infamous meeting on the 4th of February in Beijing between Putin and Xi Jinping, where there seemed to sort of be some idea that they might not have communicated clearly to each other, that they might not have kind of understood each other's meaning. I mean, in view of what you said about the relationship and the way they communicate, the language they use towards each other, what do you think happened on the 4th of February? You obviously know Russian, you know Chinese. I mean, how do they speak to each other? If they're such big friends, how do they speak to each other? And why did they probably misunderstand each other on that occasion?
I think what happened is Putin did not fully inform Xi Jinping on the scale of his planned invasion into Ukraine. I think what the Chinese side expected, or might have expected, was something that all of us expected in a sense: Russia moving in on Donbass, securing, making sure that Crimea is, the issue of Crimea is quote unquote resolved, that there are no more questions that that's Russian territory, and especially moving in on Donbass. At the same time, exerting pressure on Kiev to give up its Western plans, sort of. And there are some, and so I do not believe, with the limited information that I have, it's a mirror of a mirror of a mirror, right? That Putin went to Beijing with a map saying, this is what I'm going to do, and I need you to sign off on it. Because, of course, the main reason for the friendship narrative is to posture towards outside audiences to say that we have this partner. We have a partner to the east for Russia who has our back, and for China also to show that China is this responsible power of Eurasia who can have good relationship with its big neighbor, with its massive neighbor. Whereas domestically, of course, also to show that we're not alone for Russia. So that is my reading, I think. But by the looks of it, Putin put Xi Jinping in a very uncomfortable position because it was a kind of a add 2 + 2 situation. So probably he did know, right? And that was the perception in the West. So I think this is a very exemplary case, again, that shows the limits to this partnership, and go back to my initial point of how the stories they tell are not really based in reality, but they still somehow work.
Right. By the way, for people listening, if you wanted to put your questions in the Q&A, I'll be happy to ask them in a bit. So please do. I've got one question already, but any questions, just put them there. That would be really great. So, kind of more broadly, does Russia fear China?
Yes. And again, that is one more limitation to this partnership. just to give you a recent example, since we've moved into our era of post-February 24 events, when in the international media you hear information of how China is going to come to Russia's rescue now, with SWIFT and being if SWIFT is turned off, how China will present and its own systems, or how Union Pay is going to be the new it for Russia, or how Chinese are going to invest in Russian companies as showing solidarity in the face of Western sanctions. In Russia, in fact, coming also from the Kremlin propaganda artists, not just the general population, coming from the Kremlin propaganda artists, is the story, don't let the Chinese buy up our things. Don't let the Chinese take over our companies for a cent on the dollar now that we're being pressured by the West. If you have any money to spend, invest right now into your own companies, because the Chinese are coming. So Russia does fear China because it believes China to be an opportunistic partner that you can do things with, but at the same time that will not stop itself from feasting at Russia's table if Russia is weak.
I mean, I have to confess, I've only been to Moscow twice, once 3 years ago, once about 10 years before that. I was struck by this question of, do Russians understand China? And by that I mean that there's a tradition of sinology in Russia, which I think is strong. Good linguists, people who understand the history of China probably quite well, and definitely understand its kind of governance system, but probably don't really understand much about Chinese culture very broadly. I mean, I kind of felt that there was almost a deliberate, just not wanting to pay attention to this, just to ignore it. And so I think that was often a big kind of blind spot. But maybe I missed something. Do you feel, in researching this book, speaking with Russian colleagues, do you feel that they often understood China or wanted to understand China, or they'd invested in an image of China which was more what they wanted to see than what actually existed?
Do Russians understand China? The general population, no. There are a lot of stereotypes, misconceptions, just general lack of knowledge, and some stories of the Sino-Russian, the Soviet-Russian honeymoon in the 50s, where the Russians were the teachers coming into China. But at the same time, as he pointed out, the school of sinology has been really strong. So the people who do work with China and who are researchers and who are colleagues do have a very good grasp and a very good understanding, of course, of the language, the culture, all of it. But they're, of course, the minorities. Having said that, the Chinese language fever had swept Russia as well a couple of years ago, also due to the Chinese soft power outreach. Chinese language classes were offered in more and more schools, and including for free. It was perceived among the parents. It's of course hard to speak for everybody, but there was a trend among the parents thinking that if your children learn to speak Chinese, they will be taken care of in the future. They will be able to find good jobs. But of course, for a country that is a neighbor, that is that shares, well, now it shares a significantly less border than during the Soviet times, of course, but still that is a historic neighbor, a country with whom so much joint history, both negative and positive, there is. The understanding of China, the contacts with China are on a very, very low level. And that strikes me. And I think that also is one of the reasons why this partnership is so limited at the end of the day.
So to come to that question, actually, one of the questions from Alban Lee is, what about Russia and China's no-limit relationship? I mean, what does that mean? I mean, it seems that you're saying that, in fact, there definitely are limits.
Yeah, I just saw the question on screen and then it jumped. Oh, it jumped to answered, right? Oh, okay.
Yes, no, I'm just about, so yes, it's about
Russia and China. Well, yes, certainly. The first limit, of course, is China's willingness to venture all the way into the Russian worldview. And that is something that Russia would prefer, for China to, instead of being quote unquote neutral, or to tell stories, to quote some of Russia's stories and not say others, full support is something that Russia would be willing to have. But China only supports Russia insofar as it serves its own purposes. So just even if we look at the war in Ukraine, an interesting example is how, and I think also my colleague Igor Denisov pointed that out, how in his Diplomat article, how out of the two narratives that Russia had been peddling during before the invasion, the first narrative being NATO is pushing the US is got us encircled, so we need to do something, and the second narrative, we need to denazify Ukraine, how only the first one was adapted and adopted by China, because it rings back to what China itself is uncomfortable with. NATO stepping up in Indo-Pacific, the US becoming more active with its security architecture, such as AUKUS and the Quad. So that is something that China can get behind, right? The story of bad US serving as this challenger to stability, to global stability. But the story about Nazis is something that official Chinese outlets, the spokespeople of the ministry and so forth, cannot get behind. Well, for several reasons, of course, they've had a deep relationship with Ukraine, so they kind of know that that's not really true. On second thought, also because that immediately triggers the problematic right to protect argument. That is something that China wants to avoid because it has to do with sovereignty. It all clashes with the sovereignty issue, with the sovereignty perception that China is really strong about. So that's one of the limitations, I think. Even in this situation where a lot of analysis says that China is supporting Russia in Russia's war in Ukraine, it actually isn't, not to the full extent, not to the level that Russia would like. Nevertheless, again, the story is out there and Moscow is amplifying it because at the end of the day, it serves a purpose.
So I mean, clearly there are limits then. It's not no limits, there are definitely limits.
Yes, sorry for the long answer. I have
no.
Off record, I told my colleagues today that I'm running on fever. I think I have a fever for several. So sorry if I'm inadequate and if I'm talking too long.
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, so from Natasha Locke. So she asked, could you describe the similarities and differences of China and Russia's shared use of the victim narrative on the global stage? So, I mean, I suppose we know a lot about China's victim narrative. I mean, I guess with Russia, it's probably more in the victim narrative in the 1990s, I guess, and what happened then. But do you think that gives them a sort of point of unity, or doesn't really have much of a parallel with each other?
I think this is an exciting question for research because Russia has not been big on the victim narrative because it makes it look weak. Russia has been discursively amplifying its greatness and saying that it's being victimized goes against this goal. Having said that, of course, as you pointed out, in the 1990s and later, right now, there is the story of the naive Russians, the good guys, not knowing how Western wolf capitalism works, being taken over, being taken advantage of, and trying to make a quick buck and betraying your own country, moving to other countries with your innovation, that kind of thing. How does that compare against each other? Of course, it stems from a different story. It doesn't stem from colonialism, because let's not forget, in China's victim narrative, Russia plays the role of the oppressor, right? So it's clearly it stems from a completely different thing, and it's in a different century, and yet I think this is something that could be examined from and I would love to read that article. So if Olga is planning on writing something, please drop me a line.
Great, thank you. So this is from Michael Dillon. I'm sorry, Michael Dillon, Dr. Michael Dillon. I mean, do you think that Chinese discreet diplomacy had any impact on Russia and its change of focus to Donbas and eastern Ukraine? You know, Connie, do you think that that is possible?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. It's possible. It's possible. I think the primary factor in Russia's change of what they call the first, right, the first part of the operation completed successfully, which was of course a complete disaster. And I think that the facts were the failure itself made Russia reconsider. And I think what speaks to that also were the arrests, were the reshufflements within Russian security establishment. You could see that they weren't happy with how things were going. But how much of a role had China's discreet diplomacy played? Again, going on a hunch here, I would say probably some.
That's yeah, okay. So from Olga Alexeyeva, COVID, the impact of COVID on China-Russia relations. I mean, do you think it's had any kind of impact on how they relate to each other? Because I believe, I mean, they're pretty much kind of the same situation as everywhere else, that Russians can't go to China, and I don't think Chinese sort of are able to travel very easily to Russia now. It's probably a bit easier than it is for Europeans. I mean, do you think that's had a kind of impact? And do Russians blame China in the way that maybe Americans do about how the pandemic spread, or do they have a different mindset?
Yes, the first mentions of the Chinese virus did not actually come from Donald Trump. They were uttered in Russia. but again, this is a story of narrative saying one thing and the reality being completely the opposite. On the story side, Russia and China used COVID to signal unity, to speak about how they're learning from each other, to speak about how sort of federalization could work a little bit. So giving the regions more say, because the regions and the provinces have all their unique situations. So giving them more say over how the pandemic is handled. And also, of course, speaking about how so Russia was in the Russian outlets, you could see these messages about how China is being bullied and blamed for this virus, whereas, as a matter of fact, it had been doing so much to contain the virus. But on the ground, of course, the Russians immediately closed the border to China, not letting Chinese citizens in, even though, as Alexander Gabuyev pointed out, most of the cases of COVID were brought to Russia, not from China, but actually from Europe. But Russia did not close Europe off. Also, the immediate outbreaks of racism and xenophobia sparked across Russia. So if you were Chinese or even Chinese looking, if you were Buryat, for example, just looking as a Chinese person, you would be attacked and asked to leave in a restaurant because of the virus. But the fact that these two information spaces are so sealed off, it's still possible to broadcast these stories of mutual support and solidarity and Health Silk Road, and using this as a new momentum for launching Health Silk Road cooperation and medtech cooperation and disease control cooperation between China and Russia, that was the prevailing story, rather than all these issues that were happening on the ground.
So we have something from an anonymous attendee about public opinion in each country and guiding the relationship. In fact, in a recent book on the Russia-China border by Caroline Humphrey and Frank Billet at Cambridge. They talk about this extraordinary view by a lot of their sort of Russian field research. So this was research probably just before the pandemic. So it may have been slightly changed, but probably, you know, kind of not majorly, where a lot of the Russians in cities next to the Amur River, who they interviewed, thought that the big sort of Chinese cities they were looking at were all fake. You know, that this was like a huge kind of Ponzi scheme as a country, that China was all built on, you know, empty office space, ghost cities, and, you know, none of this was real, despite the fact that, of course, when you look at it, and actually when you move amongst these cities, they're pretty real and pretty vibrant, and so it doesn't seem to be entirely clear why they are fake. But I think that indicated some sort of antagonism, some sort of, you know, kind of big differences in views of each other. I mean, in terms, you know, of that, Putin and Xi have this great relationship, as you say, which seems to sort of be above this public opinion. But do you think that public opinion feeds into that at all? And are there aspects of that public opinion that we might sort of be missing?
There is one particular aspect of the Russian public opinion on China that is being used and that feeds back into the government narratives, and that is the idea of non-Western based economic rise. So the idea that a country can be an antagonist to the US and still be a leader, a country that has its own values that are not based in liberal democracy, and still be kind of a beacon for other countries. That story is widespread in Russia. So kind of, well done, you guys, in the sense that we should do something of that same order. Something if they did it, then we could do it, right? I think this example that you mentioned on believing that the cities across the border are fake actually is it speaks more to this Russian perception of things, of the selective belief that you believe in what's comfortable for you at the end of the day. But what I haven't read the book yet, but what I wonder is whether some level of propaganda has been feeding into this, whether these people living on the Russian side have been bombarded with videos of Chinese ghost towns, hoping that they would make a connection and think that everything on the other side is fake, so that they don't feel like their lives are actually worse than of the people from across the border. Whether the public opinion has a direct whether the public opinion can directly influence what the Russian or Chinese leaders are doing, I mean, we know that that's not true, right? That's not how it happens. But there are these motifs that can be established in the worldview that the population finds, that some part of population agrees with, and they're also dominating in the official discourse. But it's really, I mean, you know how hard it is to talk about public opinion. I think you're masterful when you're being asked this question, and I've heard you being asked this question. So what do the Chinese think, and what's the Chinese public opinion? And you always find a very elegant way to say that it depends on how you look at it, and it depends on who do you count in, and that's the issue, right? How do you measure?
Yeah, you can usually find someone to back up your theory. So sort of related to this is a question from Christian Proberger about, you know, Russia's sort of sense of it being a great power and the important power, which of course Putin really speaks to, you know, kind of this almost mystical idea of Rus, you know, the great sort of Russian kind of ethno-nation. You know, kind of, but as you said earlier, the problem is that China and Russia are not equal partners at all now. I mean, I think the Russian economy is a sixth the size of the Chinese economy, and probably getting smaller by the day because of the sanctions. So, you know, kind of, is it that really sort of Russia is partly kind of trying to prove to China that it is still a great power and has autonomy and, you know, can do what it wants. Or is it that it's slightly hung up by the fact that, well, it's a great power, but not the same as China is a great power? You know, is there a sort of jealousy there?
Absolutely, there's both. Because for the outside audiences, it's really nice to say that we, us, the great powers, here we are together, and yet we are no vassals. I love this one particular example, how China kind of shows Russia its place, but at the same time doing it in a very eloquent way. So China refers to Russia as a veteran great power. So veteran is someone whose glory days are behind them, right? So that's how. But at the same time, China, yes, at the same time, it still sounds nice. There is absolutely some jealousy there, but I think it's sometimes interesting how ideology comes into play from the most unexpected sides. Sometimes you look for ideology and you don't find it and you end up getting disappointed, and then you're not looking for it and here it is peeking from across the corner. A recent article I read from a Russian analyst actually says that the Chinese are stronger now than the Russians because they betrayed the idea of communism in the 70s. Had we been traitors as well, we would have been just as fine today, says the analyst. So all of the above.
Good. I mean, finally, a question about China's role in Central Asia. I think when the Belt and Road Initiative was originally rolled out, and I think one of the places it was Xi Jinping first announced it was, I think, in Astana, wasn't it? I believe, or, you know, kind of in 2013. But people were thinking about, you know, the kind of Eurasian economic zone that Russia was trying to sort of create, and how the two powers might become more sort of conflicted in this area. It's not something that's really kind of been noticeable recently, but do you think that there are tensions as China really offers more to Central Asian powers? And I mean, you mentioned its interest in Ukraine, which of course was significant and must be dented by what Russia has done. What do you think is going to happen about these tensions?
That's this exact frame was something that I adopted going into this chapter. I was looking to see whether this division of labor that we hear so much, so Russia being the security provider, China being the economic powerhouse in Central Asia, whether there was some truth to that, and whether there were changes to that, or was that a stable situation? And but I didn't feel confident enough about my chapter, so of course I ran it by Central Asian colleagues, and I was shocked, and my mind just opened when my colleague Nargis Kasenova said, Eurasia has so much space for development that it has enough to house everybody. It can house China, it can house Russia, it can house the US, Turkey, even the EU. If you have something to offer, Central Asia will house you. But of course, and of course, there is this understanding about the Russian security role, and I think the Kazakhstan events also showed that. Who moved in, right? Who came in? Of course, it was masked by multilateral format, but at the end of the day, we know it was the Russian army. And then they left. Was there Chinese pressure? There wasn't there. We don't know. But we also see, of course, that China is trying to challenge Russia's security dominance in Central Asia. That's why I called that particular chapter the Central Asian game of bypass, because China was working really hard to make sure it was speaking to Central Asian partners without Russia at the table. And of course, we have to remember that China has this wider concept of Central Asia. It can add or remove Afghanistan as though it has a magnet there, right? Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. So China, and I think we also saw that in Europe with 16+1, China is very sensitive about China does not respect Soviet borders. China says, we see the regions our own way, mind you. We've been there since the Silk Road. So I saw this, and I also, when I interviewed people from the region and people who had been in the establishment, they told me that, yes, you see how China is trying to, quote unquote, evict Russia from some of the security based formats. But at the end of the day, and that is, I think maybe it's Russian complacency, but Central Asia is, Russia as a culture and the Russian language is very culturally ingrained in Central Asia. Knowing all the issues and all the challenges of Russia and the Russian identity, still Central Asians know the Russian identity. They still consider it, for better or for worse, they know it. It's, you know, something that you know. Whereas the Chinese are the other. There were massive protests when the fake news in Kazakhstan spread about, you know, the Chinese being able to buy land. There were, so in that sense, I think maybe even Turkey stands a bigger chance, to be honest, than China. So regardless of the depth of the pockets or the projects that it offers, China will still be, it can all change, but the situation, the historic memory is such that China is still the other in the region.
So one final question from the audience. You know, signs of growing internal dissent in China over the last year about the conduct of the economy, the war with the Ukrainian Russian war, lockdowns in Shanghai and elsewhere. Do you see these sort of issues within China having an impact on the relationship with Russia? I mean, I suppose most pertinent is, would what Russia's doing in Ukraine and the fact that it seems not to have, I mean, it doesn't seem to have been successful. It doesn't seem like Putin, the master sort of tactician, you know, strategist is, you know, he's obviously not such a master, right? So does this sort of change China's attitude towards Russia? Is it going to see Russia as even more a kind of client state, a sort of power that it can maybe not take as seriously as it used to, and maybe regard as more of a liability than a kind of ally? I mean, do you see any possibilities of a change like that?
I do see this possibility, but I do not think it is based in China's domestic issues, the ones that were named in the question, like the COVID and also the upcoming upcoming sessions. But I do think that it is the issue for Russia becoming somewhat of a liability for China is Russia's own actions. What you pointed out, Russia's own actions and failures in Ukraine. So whether that has anything to do, I think that these issues that Xi Jinping's government has been facing in terms of public opinion, in terms of having to curb what's been going on, they, if anything, they make Ukraine a more distant question, a more distant concern. And I think we also saw that during the April 1st EU-China summit. The messaging of Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, where why do you want to talk about Ukraine so much? Yes, it's a complicated issue, and we're approaching it, quote unquote, in our own way, right? That's an interesting way how China's. But at the same time, there are so many issues. Global economy is unstable. COVID's not out the door yet. There's ecology, the always the big boogeyman that serves for a positive agenda between the EU and China. Let's talk about those issues instead. And I think that also rings back to this question.
Great. Just one final one, which I didn't spot. How will the war in Ukraine impact on China's relations with Eastern Europe?
That is excellent, because just yesterday we had a seminar organized by Harvard Davis Center and Harvard Fairbanks Center. It had a good lineup, and I was there as well, discussing this exact question. So I encourage the person who posed the question. It's on YouTube, and it's like a 1.5 hour of great stuff. But if I had to answer, so just there's smarter people than me trying to tackle this question. But if I have to just do it in a nutshell, I would say negatively, because China's relationship deterioration with Central and Eastern Europe already. By the question, I probably the person who asked it probably means this 16+1 more or less region, I think, right? Not Eastern Europe as in Moldova, yes. So the deterioration started already before that. There was the lack of deliverables. There were different outlooks on what, different expectations. So Central and Eastern Europe expected the cooperation model with China that the West was having with China, high value added trade, that kind of thing. But what China offered was basically South-South cooperation. We will give you loans, you build your roads, that kind of thing, which didn't work out. So there was already a bucket of issues leading up to Ukraine. And not, of course, a very important of them was also the August 2020 protests in Minsk, because after those, it was clear that the only viable project China's corridor going through the Great Stone and kind of approaching the Baltics, for example, is not going to work out because of the change in the approach to Belarus. So in a nutshell, negatively, but not because it's some sort of a U-turn, but because it's been building, it's more of the same.
Yeah, of course, because China and Lithuania have not had a great time lately. I think Lithuanians have been fairly strong in pushing back, and I don't imagine that they're part of the 17+1 anymore. Whatever it is, 16+1 or 15+1, it's probably going down, deflated. Look, thank you very much, Una. I mean, it's an enormously important subject, and I think you brought real insight and knowledge to it. And I think that's important when a lot of people are talking about this issue. You are someone who obviously knows both sides very, very well. So that's not, kind of common. So I really appreciate it. I would encourage people listening to get a copy of Una's book, which I think is also available electronically, I believe, isn't it? Not just as a print copy, but electronically, or at the very least get their libraries to have it. We'll certainly make sure that King's has it in the library. But I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And I hope we have you speaking back again soon.
Thank you, Kerry. It's been a pleasure. And I wish I would have spoken less and listened more, but I hope that happens next time we meet. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you everyone. And I think someone's just put in the comments where you can get the book. So please do look at it. Thank you very much. And thank you all for participating today and for my colleagues for arranging this. See you soon. Bye.